Good morning to everyone in the United States and in the Western Hemisphere, and good afternoon to our counterparts in Europe, and hello to everyone around the world joining us today for our session at the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies. My name is Jeff Rafke, and I'm the president of AICGS, and it is a real honor to have a distinguished group of guests with us today. And before I turn it over to Peter Rashish, who is the Senior Fellow and Director of our Geoeconomics program here at AICGS, I just wanted to say a word of welcome. The transatlantic economy is the most important economic relationship in the world. It remains so, and therefore we at AICGS devote a lot of attention to the economic relationship between the United States and Germany, and the broader transatlantic economic partnership. Today, we take our inspiration from a publication recently released by BusinessEurope, which is entitled EU and USA, How to Build a Positive Agenda. This is part of a continuing series we've been doing at AICGS. Just last week, we had the EU's Director General for Trade, Sabine Weyand, as a guest speaker, along with panelists. And so we're pleased to continue a conversation about the transatlantic economy. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Peter Rashish, my colleague, to lead us through and moderate today's discussion. Peter, over to you.
Jeff, thank you. And welcoming all of our viewers and welcoming our panelists. The paper that BusinessEurope has just produced on the transatlantic relationship presents the views of its 35 member organizations across Europe, and it offers some proposals for what it calls the untapped potential of the transatlantic relationship, both to create growth and for broader cooperation. And in a way, it's a sequel to the paper that BusinessEurope issued earlier in the year on the EU-China relationship, which offers a number of proposals for creating a level playing field with China's state-dominated economy. You can find the bios of all the participants on our website, aicgs.org, but let me just offer a brief introduction of all of them. Luisa Santos is the Deputy Director General of BusinessEurope, where she's responsible for international relations, and she chairs BusinessEurope's EU-UK task force. She's also a member of its expert group on EU trade agreements. And before that, she worked as the chief representative of the Portuguese textile industry in Brussels and as trade and industry manager for the European Apparel and Textile Confederation. Tom Duesterberg is a senior fellow at Hudson Institute, where he focuses on trade, global competition, and advanced technologies and the US manufacturing sector. Previously, Tom was an assistant secretary of Commerce for International Economic Policy in the administration of George H.W. Bush. He was also the executive director of the Manufacturing and Society in the 21st Century program at the Aspen Institute, and earlier president and CEO of the Manufacturers Alliance. Stormy Mildner is head of Department of External Economic Policy at the Federation of German Industries, or BDI. Earlier, she was a member of the executive board at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, also known as SWP, and she headed the Globalization and the World Economy program at the German Council on Foreign Relations. We're pleased to say that Stormy has been a visiting fellow at AICGS, and she remains a non-resident senior fellow with us and also with SWP. We'll start off with Luisa Santos, who will provide her perspectives on the report, and then both Stormy and Tom will offer their comments. We'll have a short round of moderated discussion among the panelists, and then we'll open it up to all of you for your questions. If you'd like to ask your questions, please use the Q&A button, which you can find on your screen. And the shorter they are and the more they have a question mark at the end, the more likely we'll be able to throw them into the discussion. And we will aim to close at 11 o'clock. So with that, let me hand it over to Luisa.
Thanks, Peter, and good morning to those in the US. Good afternoon to those in Europe following us. So I will ask also the support of Elizabeth to help me to pass my presentation. So I promise I will be try to be fast and not bore you too much with my slides, but it's to give you an overview of what is in our paper. So this is our paper, EU and US How to Build a Positive Agenda. Next, please. And as Peter mentioned, we had our 35 member federations very much involved in drafting this paper, including BDI. So I'm very happy Stormy is here because she and her team had a great contribution to this work as well. This is important to show that there is unanimity within the business community around the paper and the recommendations of the paper. So next, please. Maybe to give a framework of the paper, why now? We know that we are not living very easy times. On the contrary, we were quite challenging. The pandemic that we suffered and the lockdowns have intensified some of these problems. In particular, the tendency to adopt protectionist measures, the tendency to promote borders or increase measures at the border, or the tendency to create disruptions in value chains and say that, well, maybe globalization is not good because it makes us more vulnerable and less resilient to shocks like COVID-19. So this is something we are still facing, but we think trade is very important to get us out of the crisis. So this idea of, well, let's protect ourselves by building borders is something that we think is a bad decision, because we think to get us out of this crisis, we need multilateral cooperation, because it is the biggest economic trade and investment relation in the world, will be critical. Next one, please. As Peter said, I mean, this paper comes out 6 months, exactly 6 months after we published our China paper that was called EU and China Addressing the Systemic Challenge. And we think there's a lot of interaction between the two papers. We agree on many of the grievances and the problems that the US, both the administration and business, are bringing relating to China. But we think that by working together, the EU and US, and also with other partners like Japan, it's the only way we can address these challenges. So we have a lot of potential to cooperate in our bilateral issues, EU and US, but we also think that we need to cooperate more when it comes to China. And this is something that we also address in our paper. So it's true that the relationship has been going through very rough waters lately, but we think it's so big and so important that it's in both sides' interest that we need to reset, we need to renew this strategic partnership. And we knew we need to do it on a regular basis, because otherwise we drift apart. And I think this is an important element of our paper. Next, please. So one of the things we're actually proposing, and this is the first one I would mention, is the creation of a high-level platform for strategic dialogue between the US and Europe. It's funny because we have these kind of platforms with other trading partners, China, Japan, and we don't have anything like this with US. We had the tech some time ago that is not really working any longer. And it's very important that we talk to each other on a regular basis at eye level, that these talks can continue even if there is a change on administration in the US or the Commission on the European side, because this is the only way that we can, before we adopt the policies, we also can discuss about them, and we can exchange on measures that both sides are taking that could potentially have an impact, being positive or negative, on our bilateral relations. So this is very important also to address the problems at an early stage. Next, please. Then our paper basically deals with 3 different work streams. The first is the bilateral. I would put the bilateral first in this case, because we are very important. It's very important that we start addressing the issues that we have between us. Let's go for the more positive one, and some comments that might come later might say, well, you guys are dreaming, and in the current context, some of these objectives might not be easily reached. But let's try to see what we have on the table. We have a July 2019 compromise agreement between the then President of the Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, and President Trump, that still foresees the possibility of having negotiations to liberalize tariffs between the EU and US. We think it would be important to have this, to have this discussion for all industrial goods, and then adopt a sequential approach. So building on the positive developments in this area and then progressively expanding it to other areas, including agricultural tariffs, including services, digital trade, procurement, or investment. So this is one of our proposals, sequential approach, but bilateral discussions, bilateral negotiations. But of course, we are very clear that it's important that we cover a substantial part of trade and that we do not take a managed trade approach. This for us is very critical. Of course, we are not against this mini deal on lobsters, but we think this is not really achieving the whole full potential of our relation. We need to be able to go faster. And then, of course, work on all the other streams, conformity assessment, regulatory cooperation. I mean, this is not new, but the thing is, although both sides know the need to work on this, in practice, this is taking time to operationalize, and this is still and remains very important for our companies. Next one, please. The multilateral stream. The multilateral stream is, of course, critical because, as I said, we both recognize that the WTO needs reform. We know the US has a lot of criticism on the dispute settlement, in particular the appellate body. We know that the US has also a lot of criticism on the idea of special and differentiated treatment for some countries. Let's talk and let's try to find a common ground. This for us is the important thing. We all agree that these are issues. We all know that the rules of the WTO are not or no longer adjusted to today's trade and investment reality, starting with the role of state-owned enterprises, forced technology transfers. So we need to work together. One avenue is, of course, the trilateral discussions with Japan on subsidies, on industrial subsidies. But we have talked, we have reached a statement, but now we need to go to the second step. And the second step is to come up with an official proposal that we can present also to other WTO members, because otherwise we will not be able to transform our wishes into rules. Then, of course, we are both very keen to have a plurilateral on e-commerce, and I think here we also need to work together. And overall in the reform of the WTO. I think this is extremely important. Now we are in the process of discussing who will be the next Director General. Whoever the person is, it's very important that he is able or she is able to work with all the trading partners, starting with the three big ones, because it's very important also to ensure that we achieve concrete results and a meaningful, and the organization is considered again to be meaningful, both from a political but also economic point of view. So there's a lot of work on the multilateral. Next one. Then there's the unilateral. And the unilateral has taken a huge importance lately, because we know that this US administration has favored unilateral actions as a way to defend its industry and as a way, according to this administration, to settle the level playing field or ensure that there is better competition in the markets. But we believe that both these actions, 230 through to sections 232 and 301, are in the end having a huge impact on business. And the problem is these actions, many of them are taken, including sanctions, are taken at a very fast pace. and companies are taken aback and with the strong impact of these measures on existing business operations, on investments. So we think this is not the best way to work, and preferably we would like to have a more coordinated approach on these issues. And also on the European side, I mean, we have, of course, a number of initiatives that could have an impact on investment and trade between EU and US. I mentioned two, the digital service tax and the carbon border adjustment. So it's clear that the potential for additional measures on both sides with an impact on the transatlantic relation is huge. So we need to ensure that we do not stop the dialogue if we want to keep trade and investment flowing and preferably increasing. Final slide. So it's not everything is rosy. We have disputes, and I think one of the big elements also of the paper is that although we propose a positive agenda, we are also very clear that we need to address existing problems and existing frictions. And I would say, starting with a major one, and that's the Airbus-Boeing case, that is creating a number of issues between us. And we believe there is potential for escalation once the decision comes on the WTO that regarding the awards that Airbus should be entitled to on the case against Boeing. We have already duties imposed by the US on a number of European products as a follow-up of the case that Boeing won against Airbus. So, I mean, escalating duties is not a solution. We want a negotiated solution that would be beneficial for also other sectors, but including the aircraft sector, because I think we face bigger challenges from China and somewhere else. So we need to address them. And we also say that if the EU is going to react, because we are expecting a reaction from the EU, that this reaction should be proportionate, should take into account, of course, the interests of European companies, but also the wider interest of maintaining the existing value chains and the existing investment in the EU and US. So this is very briefly the presentation of our paper, and well, happy to hear the comments and reactions from my panel speakers, and then afterwards from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Luisa, for those comments, which I think very clearly lay out Business Europe's priorities. Let's turn it now to Tom Duesterberg for an American view, and then we'll have Stormy Mildner finish up with a view from Germany. Tom, over to you.
Okay, Peter, thanks to you, and thanks for having me in this very useful dialogue. And congratulations to Business Europe and to Luisa for this, I think, very constructive paper. It's refreshing to see that in this this atmosphere characterized by a lot of animosity, that we can have a constructive dialogue on how to reduce the tensions and have some constructive ways to look ahead. Let me just make a couple of comments. The atmosphere, excuse me, in the United States, I think is probably on a bipartisan basis, not yet ready for a major free trade agreement with Europe, much as I would like to have seen this in the past. Our public is just not ready for it. And I note that in a recent paper by the Chatham House, they noted that on both sides of the Atlantic, the public support for instance, the World Trade Organization is well under 50%. So we all have a lot of work to do to rebuild confidence in the value of more open trade. That being said, I'm more confident that we could start taking a series of discrete measures that will, over time, build confidence. We all know the problems with the Trump administration, especially things that are really a little bit beyond the pale, like the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, which have antagonized a lot of our friends around the world. But no matter what the outcome of the election, I think there won't be a sea change in U.S. policy. I note a very important paper by Biden advisor Jake Sullivan in Foreign Policy a few months ago, in which he said that the reconstruction of the American economy, especially the industrial sector, has to be the first step in the new administration if they assume power, and that indeed the basis of foreign policy has to be a domestic, essentially industrial policy. That's offset by a statement by another Biden advisor, Tony Blinken, yesterday to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which was a little bit more encouraging. He said, the EU is the largest market in the world. We need to improve our economic relationship, and we need to balance and undertake artificial or offset artificial trends that have been put into place by the Trump administration. So given that, I would emphasize, let's try for some of the things that are suggested in the paper that I think will over time build confidence, and perhaps at some point in time, looking ahead, we can find a way to a more comprehensive free trade agreement. Among these that I think are doable, improvement on conformity assessment, agreement on conformity assessment. I think working in the international standards organizations to make sure that those processes for setting international standards, which are increasingly important in areas like telecommunications, robotics, digital trade, there's plenty of room for us to work together. We have common interests. The Chinese now have a program on standards aiming to have more and more Chinese standards become global standards by 2030. And they use tactics like flooding the meetings at the international standards organizations, putting more low-value patents and trademarks into circulation and trying to become more dominant in the standards area. I like the idea of working together on medical supplies. I think it's obvious that we all started to turn inward at the height of the pandemic, but it doesn't seem reasonable to try to go alone, either in Europe or the United States. We both have vibrant medical product sectors. We ought to work together on that. Perhaps we could make that a plurilateral agreement and give a little bit of impetus to work in the World Trade Organization. I also welcome the suggestions of continuing the trilateral dialogue to work to find ways to modernize the World Trade Organization, and especially to offset the growing impact of China. I would suggest that we look at ways to work further together on the Chinese threat. And again, it was mentioned in Luisa's current paper, but also the China paper 6 months ago. Emphasis on denial of technology, which is sensitive to the national security interests of the transatlantic NATO partners, for instance. And Europe is making vast strides towards that, but we could work more constructively in reviving things like the Wassenaar Agreement. That assumes that we can have constructive dialogue, and perhaps Luisa's suggestion of an ongoing high-level dialogue can encompass this to work on a serious delimitation of what types of products are really vital to national security. This will include, in some instances, new definitions of economic security, perhaps, that are important to both of our industries. I'd just give one example. Strategic minerals are increasingly important to high technology industries. Rare earths are a question of interest both in Europe and the United States. China has captured the market for that and has used export controls in the past on rare earths. We also are dependent for the materials that go into electric batteries, which are important from everything from autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, to cell phones and the electric power grid based on renewable energy. So there should be reason for us to have a constructive dialogue about how to offset Chinese dominance of rare earths, and they increasingly dominate the raw materials going into electric batteries. I do think we ought to work together on WTO reform. There's not much new to say on this, except to emphasize that we need to keep our heads together and keep working together. We're never going to get China to effectively change unless we present the united front that our economic dominance around the world would suggest. I do think we need to have more emphasis on plurilateral agreements as a way forward. We mentioned medical products. There's ongoing dialogue on services. There's an ongoing dialogue on digital commerce. US, Europe, along with friends like Japan and Australia, ought to be the leaders in that and perhaps find ways forward to work together to achieve some progress. And finally, a somewhat out-of-the-box idea that's really not covered in the Business Europe paper, but what I think we need to think hard about at some level, perhaps like the G7. But in the last two economic crises, we've, to my way of thinking, over-relied on monetary policy to fix the problems in the macroeconomy. This has had a deleterious effect on the distribution of income between capital and labor. And the solutions that we have achieved in combating the recessions at least keep us out of depression, but they haven't had a good impact on creating jobs and reducing the disparities in income levels. I think we need to think seriously about some of the ways we combated macroeconomic decline in the past, using more fiscal policy. And on both sides of the Atlantic, there's a paucity of initiative from our political legislative branches and inability to work constructively to do things like a fiscal policy that would, for instance, improve infrastructure and create jobs for the millions of people who are out of work and who are lesser skilled than those in the high-tech industry. So I just throw that out as an idea that we perhaps could think about going forward. Otherwise, I think it's a constructive contribution to our debate, and I hope we follow up with a lot of the ideas that have been suggested in the paper.
Tom, thank you very much for those comments. And now let us turn it over to Stormy Mildner in Berlin.
Well, thank you so much. I'm seeing that the lighting is really off with me here. I'm changing that a little bit. It's better now. Well, thank you so much, Luisa. It's so nice to see you and presenting this paper, which we very much liked to work on, because we believe it's such an important topic. And thanks so much also to Tom to giving the broader context of what is doable and what isn't, and bringing in some of your own ideas. What I wanted to do is get a little bit more into this context and ask what would be our options and what could we do under two different scenarios. So one scenario, another 4 years of Trump, and another scenario of 4 more years of Biden. But before I get into this, I just wanted to emphasize what Luisa had said in the beginning of her presentation, that the European Union and the United States are each other's most important trade and investment partners. So it makes a lot of sense for us to get closer together instead of widening the Atlantic further. And not just that we are economically strongly interdependent, we also have a strong foundation of common values, interests, and a shared history, which we often, I mean, at least in the last 3 years, seem to forget. And that is a strong foundation we build on. And I'm not saying that we don't have a lot of conflict, quite the contrary. I agree with Luisa. We have the steel and aluminum tariffs, which are still really a problem, also from our point of view. The threat of tariffs on cars is still not off the table completely, so that is bothering us. We have the aviation conflicts with lots of tariffs on EU products and the carousel approach, so that's another conflictual area. We also have Iran sanctions, Russia sanctions, the extraterritoriality of sanctions, export controls, US export controls with extraterritorial character. We have our divergent views with regard to China, with regard to the World Trade Organization. And in the COVID-19 crisis, some new fault lines have opened. So there are a lot of conflicts. And not only this, our confidence in each other and also the trust in each other has really suffered. And I just want to underline this with a few numbers of a recent poll conducted by the Pew Research Institute and the Kerber Foundation. And they found that 73% of Germans surveyed said that the image of the United States had deteriorated further during the Corona period. And while in 2019, about twice as many Germans had preferred their country's relationship with the United States over China, so 50% compared to 24%, this percentage has fallen by 13 percentage points. Germans and Americans do agree on something, and that we are not each other's most important foreign policy partners anymore. So for the US, it's Great Britain. For Germans, it seems to be France. So we have really a fundamental problem, and we have to work on this. So just briefly, what would another 4 years of Trump mean for our transatlantic EU-US, but also German-US relationship? Well, nothing good, obviously. So the uncertainty in our relationship would remain really high. I think that trust would deteriorate further, no matter what we do with regard to any bottom-up approaches. It would remain really difficult. I assume that the geo-economic rivalry with China, the US-China conflict would escalate, which would also have implications on the transatlantic relationship. And I believe that the conflicts which we are having in our relationship would further escalate. So probably no conclusion of the Airbus-Boeing conflict. The threats of tariffs on cars would probably remain. The same with regard to export controls, investment screening, all those measures which are meant to decouple the United States from China. I think that's all going to remain, and a positive agenda. Although I would love to see, Luisa, all our recommendations implemented, it will be extremely tough under another 4 years of Trump. And I'm really afraid what that might also mean to the multilateral trading system, to the WTO. So would everything be good with a Biden president? There is really a lot of hope in Germany for a restart of the transatlantic relationship. And if you look at the rhetoric and also the experiences Biden brings along, and he really is a transatlanticist. He knows Europe. His style is very different from Trump. He values his allies. And I think he would reestablish dialogue and trust, and a certain, we in that regard, the tone would be very, very different. And I also believe that there are new areas for cooperation in the WTO and also the WHO, the World Health Organization, because I think he does want to reestablish the United States on the world stage. But I don't think that we will get back to the good old times, if there ever were such good old times in the transatlantic relationship, because as as we have heard before, as Tom, you pointed out, there are a lot of things where he does not differ that much policy content-wise from Trump. So I think the government procurement by American approach would remain, the reshoring approach would remain. The conflict with China will certainly not disappear. The geo-economic rivalry, which will also spill, which has an effect on China. And on top, I think it might get quite uncomfortable for us because Biden will ask a lot more of Europe in terms of taking on responsibility. And we will not be able to hide behind our criticism towards the Trump administration and its policies anymore, but we have to decide. We have to decide on our position with regard to China. We have to decide on our position with regard to Russia and many other issues. So it might become a lot more uncomfortable. And that brings me to my last point. It takes two to tango, as always. And I think we will only be an attractive partner in this relationship or in this tango if we get our own house in order, the European house. And I do see that we have still some fundamental problems. We have a problem with passing trade agreements. We just saw it again with regard to the signature of Mercosur. We still don't have a unified China policy. We still don't have a unified Russia policy. And I'm not so sure if we already have a unified policy with regard to the reform of a lot of EU instruments, like the trade defense instruments or the anti-subsidy instrument and many other issues. So we also need to be an actor on the stage and to be a partner. The EU has to act as a partner and do get its house in order. And so it's important what Luisa is now also doing with her team. She is working on a submission in the EU consultation for the trade policy reform, and also with regard to the white paper on anti-subsidies. That plays a big role. So our job also as business is not over yet, but we are working on recommendations to make the EU a more proactive or active actor on the world stage. And I ended with this.
Stormy, thank you very much. Let me just throw out a couple of questions before we turn over to viewer questions. Luisa, the paper I think is courageous on the one hand and yet realistic about proposing opportunities for transatlantic cooperation. So my question may have a bit of a devil's advocate tone to it, but at the risk of that, you know, when we look at the EU, fairly or unfairly, a number of concerns, well, one of the main concerns that I think a fairly wide spectrum of people in Washington have is the recent emphasis on sovereignty in the EU. And we particularly see that in technological sovereignty. I think that, the President von der Leyen's ambition to have a geopolitical European Commission is admirable. And the question is, how far does that go? And does something like technological sovereignty, like the EU developing its own cloud with the Gaia X program and a number of other things, does that necessarily get in the way of transatlantic cooperation and some of the things the paper outlines? Or can stronger EU sovereignty in technology or economic areas be made to work with stronger transatlantic cooperation?
Thanks, Peter. Well, we had that discussion also within Business Europe. We had, of course, also produced a paper that is called Smart Technological Sovereignty, because which is equivalent. I mean, there's a lot of concepts going on. I mean, the Commission talks about open strategic autonomy. But in the end, we are all talking about the same thing. I think that the EU getting stronger in a number of areas should not be considered as a threat to our trading partners, as a threat to China or as a threat to the US. I mean, if the US is very strong on tech, that's great. It has a huge number of its companies that are leaders in the world. China is developing its own. It's normal that Europe tries to develop also its own capacities. What we don't want is this supposed to be done artificially in either side. And that's why, as Stormy was saying, I mean, the EU is now also looking at an instrument on foreign subsidies, because we believe that we have a huge problem also at the WTO level. A lot of countries are not notifying their subsidies. And this is an issue. And we think it's an issue that will increase now with COVID, because we're going to have massive influx of money going to the economy. So we need to make sure that these subsidies are not distorting further the market reality. So, but the fact that Europe is getting stronger in some areas, if it is according to market rules, I don't see this as a threat, and it should not be taken as a threat by the US, because we are not saying, okay, we're going to be using only European companies and not US companies. That's not the point. And that's also why we say we need to remain open to the world. We cannot, even if we are strengthening our instruments on FDI screening, even on export controls, we should not be closing the market. This is not the objective. And ideally, all these measures, we should try to have, of course, a multilateral framework. It's not always easy, but we should, at the same time, try to engage with our major trading partners to explain the reasons behind, to make them understand also that if we are doing this, it's not against them. It's just that we need to make sure that we have the necessary tools to make sure that our companies also have a competitive environment in Europe. So it's not against them, it's just strengthening Europe. And this is in the interest also of the US, is to have a stronger Europe. I think to make sure that we side more on issues relating to foreign policy, also relating to China. Europe needs to get strength. And this is a fundamental issue for us. We are a big economic power, sometimes not a big political power. And this is something that it is creating issues right now. And you've seen it for when we're talking about sanctions, for instance, all the difficulties we have. And all this process is part of making Europe stronger. And that would help also address a number of issues, and possibly even be favorable to the transatlantic relation and help also the transatlantic relation.
Thanks. Stormy, Tom, would you like to comment on that?
Well, I take a stab at it. You know, from the U.S. perspective, this idea of making Europe stronger is, I mean, I don't know that anyone has any problems with that. And I think most of us would welcome you know, a robust European economy, because it is our largest trading partner, and it's the largest source of foreign direct investment in the United States, and vice versa. I think there's a fair amount of skepticism about the ability of Europe to become a real competitor in high-tech industries. This idea of cloud computing, or even in semiconductors, these are hard areas to penetrate, and there's the leadership is clearly on the American side and somewhat on the Chinese side there. And so in order to get even think about being competitive, it's going to require a lot more subsidization than Europe seems to be willing to put into this. I mean, I looked a few years ago at German investment in Industry 4.0, and it was less than $1 billion a year, which is not material. Let's put it that way. So the other problem with this is that it will require fairly large amounts of subsidization for the Europeans to even think about becoming competitive in some of the high technology areas. And of course, if we are going to try to limit subsidization in China, this sort of ruins the chance to do that through the WTO. Now, the United States is not totally innocent on this. The impetus in the last year, in the wake of the pandemic, in areas like semiconductors, is to think about putting federal money directly into, for instance, subsidizing the production of semiconductor fabrication plants. Now, we might concoct ways to get around formal violation of WTO rules, which of course are very weak on subsidies now. But if we are serious about trying to challenge the Chinese mercantilist model, this idea of competitive subsidization is going to ruin that prospect, I think.
Right. Stormy?
I just wanted to pick up on one point, which Tom just said, that I think you said that nobody in the US would have a problem with the European Union becoming stronger or using its competitive edge, and I do agree, and I somewhat also disagree. And I'm thinking of what would happen if we, for example, had a stronger enforcement regulation, which the EU is currently working on, such as a little bit into the direction what the Parliament proposed, that we can also implement retaliatory tariffs before a WTO report. So it goes a little bit into the direction of a 301, Section 301 approach. And if we use this also against the United States, I'm wondering what would happen if we developed a tool to protect ourselves against the extraterritoriality of sanctions and started to use retaliatory measures against the United States in other policy areas, not related to the sanctions. For example, to limit the protection of intellectual property rights as a means to counter the extraterritoriality. What would the US do if we started to develop a tool with which to circumvent the refinancing through the dollar to enable us to continue to trade with Iran and other problematic states from the point of the United States? And I think that then the answer probably would look a little bit different. And that's what, with all due respect to all our own ideas on what we, how we want to strengthen the transatlantic relationship. On the other hand, we are developing tools right now, which we also want to use against the United States. So we do have to balance our interests here, and we do also have to talk with the United States really about what we are doing, because it could open up a whole new box of conflicts in the future.
Well, let me pick up on that idea. Luisa, in the paper, as you mentioned, Business Europe suggests the creation of a strategic council, and you also talk about picking up on the trilateral effort among the U.S., EU, and Japan on Wto Reform, and Tom and Stormy have talked about that too. This may be a little bit of a blue sky idea, but how realistic do you think it would be as one of the #1 agenda items for that strategic council to have the US and the EU not just, as Stormy suggests, kind of keep each other informed about things like where the US trade enforcement might go or where EU trade enforcement might go, but actually trying as much as possible to harmonize the US and EU approach, so that you both in the sense of how often and when and where you would use something like Section 301 or the EU's new trade enforcement regulation, and what they would cover, so that you would head off in advance a bit of the risks of conflict that Stormy pointed out.
That's a very good question, and I think it all goes back to how the politicians in particular are perceiving the transatlantic partnership. Because the impression we have is that this is considered to be a given. It's a given. It's big, it's there, it works on its own, I mean, even if we take measures that could potentially impact it negatively, it's so strong that it will persist. I think the important thing, and what Stormy said, is she described a number of actions that could potentially impact it significantly, this relation, because for the moment, let's be very open. I mean, the US has been acting unilaterally on many fronts, imposing duties on the European Union. We reacted, but we always reacted on the basis of a WTO decision in general. And we have tried always not to escalate the conflict. If the EU starts going the US way, meaning, okay, we start anticipating and we start, we also interpret some legislation in the US or some actions in the US. I mean, we consider the extraterritoriality of US secondary sanctions as be against WTO rules. So should we act? Should we use this new instrument to act and also impose sanctions on the US? So if we start doing this, which is something we would like to avoid, it will really have an impact on the transatlantic relation. So we hope that the idea of this dialogue is also to try to see that both sides are really committed to this transatlantic partnership. They really understand that it's not that if we continue the way we are, one doing one thing and the other responding, and the other doing, the other responding, this eventually will significantly hamper the relationship. Do we want to do that, or do we want to start working really as partners? And if we start, because the companies work as partners, huh? If we start working really as partners and we start anticipating and trying to, what do we want to achieve from WTO reform? How do we want to address the challenges that China puts to us? Yes, then we can, go to different policy areas and start seeing what we can do better together. The other option, frankly, and I don't want to be alarmist here, is that we will continue to build the arsenal, and we will find ourselves at one day, oh, this has really had a huge impact economically as well. So, and I think we don't want to reach that phase.
Peter, can I just make a quick comment?
Please.
I think it's useful to differentiate between U.S. actions like 232 and 301. I'm not particularly fond of our 232 actions. I think they've been misused, although there is a need for that sort of instrument. 301 was against China, and it's just a result of total frustration with the ability of the World Trade Organization to address the theft of intellectual property, the misappropriation of intellectual property. And it was also due to a lot of frustration with our European friends who chose not to, in most instances, join us in a robust way in taking on the Chinese threat. So there is a way around this, which is, of course, maybe through this high-level dialogue, developing a little bit more coherence in our approach to China. I mean, after all, the Chinese system, the mercantilist system, is actually more of a threat to Europe than it is to the United States because of the total amount of subsidization and the dependence of the European economy on, for instance, the Chinese auto sector. Which is going to be a problem going forward for Europe, I think. So let me stop there.
Okay, let me remind the viewers we have a few more minutes left. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A button. Here's one question, and that is that if there were a Biden administration come next January, do any of you think that it be a good idea to prioritize a digital US-EU digital trade deal, which I guess could be WTO consistent because there aren't many multilateral rules, as a way, among other things, as a way to head off a conflict over digital services taxes that either individual EU countries or the EU as a whole may decide to implement. How realistic is that idea?
I don't know if Stormy, you want.
Well, I think it's, I mean, I think it's worth a try, and I think there is an ongoing dialogue. I don't know if we could get to the point where we could have an agreement which would dissuade Europe from imposing digital taxes. I just don't know. The politics of that seem very opaque to me. We have a truce at the moment, but the truce is not going to last too much longer. So in general, I'm in favor of addressing these things through plurilateral agreements, and it would be a major achievement if we could get to a point where we can have a digital agreement, sectoral digital services agreement.
Another question asks, Tom, and I hate to be looking at you again, but it mentions it's directed at you, and that is, is it realistic to think that the US and the EU can devise ways to handle the challenge from China that don't at some point lead to a discernible amount of decoupling? And isn't decoupling inevitable between the US, perhaps the EU, and China?
Well, my own view is that the key is China itself. At this point, if you read all of their policy documents, they clearly point in a direction of autarky in certain ways and expansion of their sort of zone of economic influence. I don't think in the long run that's a good thing for their economy. I think their economy is way too unbalanced in terms of export orientation. I don't think they have the technological expertise without cooperation of some sort or outright appropriation from the US and Europe of key technologies. So I don't think in the long run it's in their economic interest. One area to look at is China does have this program, I forget what the term of art is, of recirculation or something like that, which is essentially is relying more and more on their domestic consumption as an engine of growth. And it may be useful for the US and Europe to find ways to encourage that. China will always try to fulfill its own needs through domestic production, but they can't do it in lots of technology areas. They can't do it in energy. So perhaps instead of trying to negotiate through, well, in addition to negotiating through the World Trade Organization to get new rules, we could just encourage them as a macroeconomic matter to continue to develop their domestic economy. After all, China's total percentage of the GDP that's represented by personal consumption is 39%. So that's one reason for the huge trade surpluses that they generate.
Okay, thank you.
Can I also react? And I see that Stormy also wants to react. Maybe maybe on the digital taxation. I think we've always been pretty clear. We would like to have a plurilateral solution to this. We don't think it's the right way that each one starts developing his own tools. But we also think this is an area, together with the environment and climate, where we have a huge public opinion pressure also, at least in Europe. So I think the governments are also being forced to do something. And this is not going to go away. So it is something that is going to stay. I mean, we can discuss how to do it in a way that does not create huge problems and that is harmonized in a way, and that's why plurilateral will be the best. But I mean, it's also the question of the legitimacy also of the governments in front of their public opinion. So it's something that is not going away. It's not something only on Europe, because we know in the US many are also talking about it. So I think we need to work together on this. But there's one important, as in China, but there's one important point, is that it's going to be really open-minded discussions. Because when I hear, and I'm sorry, Tom, when I hear people in the US systematically telling us, oh, but you're not willing to do anything on China. Oh, but you're not. Yes, well, we are not willing to put tariffs on China from one day to the other. No, but we are willing to discuss the best approach. But what we cannot have is either US or Europe saying, well, it's my policy, take it or leave it. That should not be the basis. So I think we need to start really a dialogue and not one side telling the other, either you do what I tell you or we don't do anything.
Stormy, the last word is yours.
Oh no, not the last word. The last word is going to be yours.
Next to last.
Yeah, but now I wanted to really underline what Luisa has said. It needs to be a joint approach, and plus the target should not be moved whenever the EU does something, and we did quite a bit with regard to China already. Then the in German we would say Messlatte, then that where you measure the EU with is just moved one step further and one step further and one step further. So we really need to go together instead of one pushing the other or pulling the other. I just wanted to say one thing about the digital trade or e-commerce issue, and also on subsidies and state-owned enterprises. I do agree with Tom here that a plurilateral approach would be really the best way to go, and preferably under the WTO. Coming to the question if that should be done before the elections or before we know if it's Biden or Trump, that's a too short time frame in the WTO context, especially because of the selection process of the DG going on. But next year, with the run up to the next ministerial conference, that is really something where we need to work together on. And the proposals by the trilateral initiative are fantastic on subsidies and state-owned enterprises. They're really good, but I don't see the EU and the US working together trying to get other countries on board in the WTO, and that really needs to happen. Otherwise, it's just not going to fly. And that's so to say my last word as an example. If we just think about ourselves, we are still not going to succeed. We need others to come on board as well. Otherwise, we are just going to fail jointly.
Well, let me take that next to last word to add my own and say that I think that's a strong point to end on, because I do think there's some credence to the idea that even with the Biden administration, a US-EU free trade agreement might not be the #1 item on the agenda. And so something more along the lines of transatlantic cooperation to bolster the international economic system and the WTO. And I think that's probably more, build some rules. That's probably a more realistic outlook. And so thanks for that last comment. So my real last word is to thank all of you. Thank you, the speakers. Thank all of the viewers. Let me also thank my colleague, Elizabeth Karut, for her help putting this together. And just to say that we've recorded this event, and you can also find it on our website, aicgs.org shortly. So have rest of a good morning or afternoon to you, wherever you may be. And thanks a lot for joining.